So I don't know how many of you know this, but Pentecost is actually a Jewish holiday. In Judaism, it's called Shavuot. And it is one of the three major pilgrimage holidays in Judaism. So prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, when Jerusalem was just laid waste, everything was destroyed. The whole city became a garbage dump for like hundreds of years. But the Temple Mount was completely obliterated. That's why whenever you see images of Jerusalem today, there's like this one piece of the Western Wall. That's like all that's left of the temple, and that's why that's a holy site. But Pentecost is in the Jewish tradition is called Shavuot, and it's one of the three major pilgrimage festivals. And each pilgrimage festival actually happens to also be a harvest festival. So Passover, or Pesach, is the harvest festival of barley, and that's the remembering of the passing over of the angel of death to protect them while they were slaves in Egypt. Then you've got Shavuot, which we call Pentecost, which is the wheat harvest, and that's the celebration of the coming of the law, right? The receiving of the Ten Commandments, and really, arguably, the receiving of Torah, all first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, through Moses. And then you've got the third one, which is Sukkot, which is a fruit harvest festival. It's in the fall. And that one is where part of the celebration is that you go outside, you build a booth, and you live in it for a week to remember wandering in the wilderness. So all three of the pilgrimage festivals are really about remembering this identity that's really central in Judaism of we were once slaves in Egypt. God brought us out of Egypt, brought us through 40 years in the wilderness, and then brought us to this place where we now have the law, we have this covenantal relationship with God. None of the three are actually about arriving in the promised land, which I think is interesting. All three of them are about the experience of getting out of slavery and being cared for in this liminal space of the wilderness, and this connection that God has with humanity that's manifest in the Torah, the 10 Commandments, really the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And talking to a Jewish rabbi friend of mine, he's like, we often think of the law and the 10 Commandments as being Torah, right? That it's all about the rules and regulations. We spend a lot of time with Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and that all gets complicated. But he said, the law actually begins in the beginning. It begins at creation. That's the foundation of Jewish law. It's not all the commandments and the restrictions and the shouts and shout nots. It's this idea of the earth, the creation. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and we benefit from existence, right? That we stand not in this role of submission, but in this role of reception. Everything is free gift, and that's where we start from. That we don't do anything towards God except as a response. And that's the idea of the law. That's the idea of the covenant. That's the idea of the commandments, is that it's supposed to be this response to this awareness of the reality of the bigness and the generosity of God. It's how we show thanks for God's generosity. That's the idea of the law in Jewish thinking. It's not this kind of like earned worthiness stuff that Christianity is often painted as. And we get that confusion because we don't really understand Paul's arguments in Romans and Galatians when he contrasts the law and grace, right? Paul spends a lot of time talking about this, and we often read this through an anti-Jewish lens and think he's talking about the law as this cumbersome, burdensome weight that people are all carrying around, and poor Jews have to deal with the law, but we Christians are free from it. That's not, I'll spend some time on that at a later date and help you pick apart Romans and Galatians, but the fact of the matter is that the law is really just a way of helping people understand how to respond to the gift of grace. And so it's interesting that Pentecost has become a Christian holiday for the receiving of the Spirit, because you can see how in so many ways it's the same thing, but through a Christian lens. Right? There was a lot of tension in the early church, a lot of tension about whether you had to become a Jew or not. Now, everybody was terrified of circumcision, because who wants that? Especially as an adult. Saw you cross your legs just then. Right, but there was all kinds of other stuff that was happening where people were coming, the folks from Jerusalem who were part of the kind of the original core group were going to traveling around to these other churches that Paul had started, and they're like, yeah, you got parts of it, but look at what you're eating. Look at how you're washing. Look at how you're like. There's a lot of things that are not right here. Y'all need to get right with Jesus, meaning y'all need to get right with Judaism. And Paul had this big conflict with the church in Jerusalem where the apostles were, right? Peter, James, John, all these guys. James, the brother of Jesus, ended up leading the church there. And he had a really strong, like, you need to become a Jew first attitude about it. And so Paul had to actually go to the church in Jerusalem and have this big conference with them and like work out a way to invite the Gentiles in. Sorry that this is a history lesson, but I don't know how many of us actually know this piece of history. And so it's a big tension in the early church, whether you had to be a Jew or not, and then what is the role of Judaism in Christianity if you don't have to become a Jew. And a lot of this conversation about anti-Semitism that's happening on campuses now, that's about the nation of Israel and the people of Palestine, it's hard to parse it out, but a lot of the way that that's being read has a lot to do with how we framed out Christianity and its relationship to Judaism. A lot of this conversation about the law and grace has a lot of these strong anti-Semitic tones underneath of it. A lot of this in-group, out-group, a lot of the ways actually that Christians even reflect on Pentecost as a transformation of Shavuot into an inclusive thing instead of an exclusive thing. You can hear right away that already has some anti-Jewish tones to it. Because it's this assumption that the Jewish God only loves Jewish people. And now Jesus came to correct the Jewish God who was a problem and creates this all-inclusive loving God who's clearly better than the Jew. You can hear the anti-Semitism that's baked into that, right? The problem is that we don't know enough about Judaism to really articulate some of this stuff differently. And I'm not a scholar on Judaism, so all I can say is that I don't know enough to really explain this. But I do know from my Jewish friends that we have deeply misunderstood the giving of the law. We have deeply understood what the relationship of the people is to the law. And so maybe reclaiming Pentecost for us as Christian people can actually help us address some of this issue. Because really, the coming of the law, like the coming of the Spirit, is this realization of how to respond to God's grace. How do we respond to the gift of being alive, the gift of relationship, the gift of God's presence? And for Pentecost in particular, it's really a celebration of the gift of Moses and his life, right? Because the first 5 books of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, are called the Torah, right? They're the law. And they're the books of Moses. They come from Moses. There are, the history says that they were all written by Moses, which is funny because it describes his death and his burial. So you're like, that's cool. But regardless, so when we talk about the law and the gift of the law, we're really talking about the gift of this man who was so committed to following God into these really complicated and unfortunate circumstances, right? We did this whole series on going through the wilderness for Lent. So you remember some of these stories of how frustrating and difficult this was for Moses. And did he want this job? No, he did not. He made the mistake of paying attention to something shiny and on fire, and then started talking to him, and he's like, oh, crap. I started saying a thing, now I have, right, you speak a thing, and now it's real, now you gotta do something about it. It's the same. If we'd have just been like, nope, no thanks, fire, not touching it, maybe things would have been different, but that's not what happened. And he complained to God. He says, God, I am not the guy for this. This is not my work. I can't really talk that well. God's like, man, I got you. We got Aaron right here. He's a good talker. And Moses is like, yeah, but he's kind of a mess. And God's like, yeah, I kind of know that, but we'll work through it. It's fine. You got any other excuses? Well, I'm not really magical. I'll give you a stick. It's got magic. We're good to go. Moses doesn't have any more excuses, and so he has to go and do this thing. Have you guys ever heard the phrase, God doesn't call the equipped, God equips the called? Have you ever heard that before? Have you ever been in a place where you didn't know how to do what you're being asked to do? and you were pretty sure you couldn't do it, and really you just didn't want to do it, and so you tried to come up with all kinds of excuses, and then all kinds of resources started flowing in to help you do it, and you were like, damn it, I'm out of excuses. That's Moses right there. Can you get the next slide for me? So all of those places that were mentioned are all kind of part of what we call the diaspora around Jerusalem, where Jewish folks have communities. So remember that Judaism is not an individualistic religion, it's a communal religion. It has all of these different requirements and rituals that are really about gathering people together and telling stories, telling your history. Who are you? Who are we? Right? Think about the 3 pilgrimage festivals. They're all about we were slaves in Egypt and God liberated us and walked with us through the messiness of the wilderness. Right? This sense of God goes with us. And so these are all these different places where people had come from to get to Jerusalem. And every year, 3 times a year, all men of age who weren't disabled in some way were expected to make the trek. And that's pretty far if you think about it. Like, some of these people are coming from quite far away. And so there'd be these established pilgrimage routes, there'd be places to stay along the way. Remember we talked about with Boy Jesus and the temple, like it's like 3 or 4 days journey for them to get back to Nazareth. So we're talking about weeks of time to do this travel. And you got all these people from all of these different places streaming into Jerusalem. I mean, you can imagine how full this city got. It got like 10 times its normal size, just like seething mass of humanity. So of course people weren't in Jerusalem proper all the time. They were in all these outlying villages around the outside, and there'd be all kinds of hospitality that'd be happening, blah, 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 blah. But the idea of a pilgrimage faith is really central to Judaism, because it's about all of these people who have moved out into the diaspora, who are starting to get disconnected, who are living in these other communities, under these other empires, under these other cultural customs. They have to go in together to remember who they are. And these 3 pilgrimage festivals are really about remembering this God who is on the side of the slave, who's on the side of the underdog, who's on the side of the apparent loser in the war of empire, and who goes with us in these difficult times, who stays with us, provides us succor and support, literally food and water coming out of the desert, right? That these stories are about remembering, and the rituals that are done at these festivals are about remembering and retelling the story, getting your kids to retell the story, picking out different ritual objects and foods that represent parts of the story. I encourage you to learn a little bit more about the meals that are served at these 3 festivals, because they'll show you some of the ways that that story is told in the eating and the drinking and the praying and the moving and the reading and the gathering. It's all really intentional about building a memory that people didn't actually have, right? Because this is generations and generations and generations after the Exodus. And so in Jewish culture, you say, remember you were a slave in Egypt. Well, was I a slave in Egypt? Were we slaves in Egypt? What does it do to say, remember that we were slaves in Egypt? It immediately puts us on the side of the vulnerable. It immediately puts us on the side of the oppressed. It reminds us, no matter how comfortable we are in Rome and Pontus and Parthia and Elam, that we are aligned fully with the dispossessed, as is our God. And we come together to tell this story again and again to make sure that our alignment is correct. You know, sometimes people talk about Judaism as this inward-facing faith because it has so much of this coming together to tell the story. But if you think about the meaning of this story, it's about coming together so that we are all in alignment, facing the same thing, facing the same way, facing a responsibility to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God, right? But pilgrimage is about going in. And what's amazing about Pentecost is the Christian festival of Pentecost is about then going out, right? Because this miraculous thing that happened is that all these peasants who didn't live all that far from Jerusalem, who probably spoke Aramaic or Koine Greek, because that's what they would have learned to interact with empire, probably their whole lives, and probably had really no good concept of any of these other spaces, except maybe in lore, or you've heard a traveling narrative from somebody who stayed at your house for a week, or you've got a great cousin, or whatever. They wouldn't know any of these languages. But this miraculous thing happens where somehow, amazingly, they're able to speak these languages. And people from all over are like, I'm not just hearing in Aramaic, which is what I came here and I crossed the threshold and now I'm speaking Aramaic and now I'm showing up, I've code switched, here I am in Jerusalem, we're all gonna do this thing and then I'll go back home and take whatever. Now I'm here in this place where I'm supposed to conform and it's conforming to me. It's welcoming me. That's not a thing that was supposed to happen. And it's coming from people that shouldn't be doing that. People that shouldn't know this. People that have no reason to care about me or meet me where I am. You can see where I'm going with this sermon, I hope, right? Because Jesus is gone, right? Jesus has floated away. We talked about that last week. And so what happens when no one's the host? Everybody's the host. What happens when you're in a place where no one's responsible for the hospitality? What happens when the minister just has to bounce? Right? Part of being a church is about being a community of pillars that holds each other up. We do what we can when we can, and when we can't, we trust that someone else is going to come in and be a pillar for us. I had a professor in seminary who said, you don't come to church when you need it, because if everybody only came to church when they need it, when you came, no one would be there. Right? You come to church when you don't need it, when you have something to give, because then when you need it, if that's the culture that you create, then somebody will be there to give something to you when you need it. But we create a culture of coming together to give and support. But the interesting part is we start by welcoming people in first. So there's this mnemonic, first you believe, then you behave, then you belong. And this is an idea about forming people into good church people. First, you have to make sure that they understand who Jesus really is and that he died for you in particular, and you need to consent and really submit to this idea. Believe first, then we'll figure out your behavior. We'll start working on you. You need to start showing that you believe by acting in such and such a way. You better not ever do this, or at least keep it in the closet for a while. Forever, that's what I meant. And then you can belong, right? Once you believe right and you behave right, then you can belong. Well, I happen to believe that Jesus works the exact opposite. I happen to believe, at least the Christ that I follow says you belong first. You are worthy of dignity and respect. You are worthy of welcome and hospitality. You are welcome here first. And when you are welcome in a space, it starts to change how you behave in that space. When you experience full hospitality and love and grace and graciousness, then you start getting your cup filled up. And then your cup can start overflowing, and then you have the space and the comfort and the ease and the trust to then be able to give out of your own heart, to be able to start offering parts of yourself, to be able to welcome, be an ambassador for that welcome that you received. And that forms what you trust in. I don't like the word believe, I like the word trust. That forms what you trust in. That forms your understanding of God and God's consistency through time and how God and the Spirit manifest in each of us. First, we belong, and then it impacts how we behave, and then that informs how we believe. We're creating a new memory. That's what we're doing as a church. We're creating a new memory of inclusivity, of what it means to be fully welcomed. Because out in the world, we're welcomed for parts of our identity or our skill set or our money or whatever we have, whatever we can do, right? And that thing about money that you mentioned earlier about church is really true, right? There's so much financial anxiety, so much concern about the building, the priest or the pastor or whatever, and the technology and the production and the music, right? That we gotta pay for all this stuff, and that becomes what the whole thing is about. But what we're really doing is we're building in a new communal memory in people of what it was to be outside and what it is now to be inside. And there's a lot of ways to read Paul that are really problematic about this same idea that the sinful man is dead and the new man is born and blah, blah, blah. And you can spend a lot of time getting hung up on that stuff if you want. You can also say there was a time where I felt like I wasn't worth anything, I wasn't welcome, I didn't matter, no one cared. And now I've had an experience in a place. And what I want more than anything is that this place is less important than the experience inside of you that has imprinted upon you a new memory of who you are. Because if this place, particularly this church, is what matters most, then we're screwed. Because this thing can fall apart in a million different ways, right? This is temporary, right? But if what happens is you participate in this place and it changes you somehow, it gives you a new memory, a new story about God's faithfulness, about the possibility of your own generosity changing the world, about this thing inside of you, this Holy Spirit that has movement and power and life and vitality that can pour out of you, that you can channel. Then wherever you go, you will be an agent of that God. But if you need this particular building to do it for you, I'm sorry, because we're going to bulldoze the thing in a couple of years. Right? If you need this particular pastor to do it for you, I'm sorry, but an aneurysm or a car accident will take him away from you. Mm. Shit happens.
You could also just get another job.
Yes, that's also possible. But what I'm saying is that it's about that transformation in us. And that's the Pentecost story. It's this profound moment of experience of like, whoa, we're making something here that is giving us a new memory and a new story, which in my mind aligns beautifully with Shavuot. It aligns beautifully with the Jewish tradition about what is the memory that we're recreating collectively that then we can take back out into these places. You get the next slide for me. So I come back to this question. What is the work of the church today? And in my mind, as I look at the early church, I think there's three things. Two of them are going to be obvious to you, and one of them might be pretty radical, and maybe is the one we need to start thinking about. So the two that I think are very obvious is this sense of worth. This not codependent, this differentiated sense of internal value. I matter. Do you all know? Have you all come to that place? Where are you at on your I am worthy of dignity and respect. My particularity matters. No matter what I have to give, no matter what I can do, no matter how my body's working, no matter how my mind's working, I have value to God. That's a rhetorical question. You don't need to answer, but I want you to be thinking about, is that a thing that you're growing in this church and in your relationship with God and Jesus and the Spirit? Is that sureness, that prautes, that gentle strength of divine origin that you have worth? Because I think that is a thing that the world needs desperately. I think people do not necessarily have access to that other places in their life. It's hustle, grind, produce, earn, deserve. It's not worth. The second one is this experience of forgiveness, of resurrection, of redemption. Because guess what? Shit happens. And we screw up, and we hurt people's feelings, and we get rejected, and we break stuff. How many times did we break stuff? How many things did I break in my house this week because I was going too fast and not paying attention, and it shattered, and I just said, God, I'm so stupid. And my son says, don't say that, Dad. Mm. I won't have a feeling. Yeah. Just an accident. And I thought, yeah, because how many times Did he hear that?
Yeah.
He rose, right? You know, they echo it back to you, right? You learn what your values are. How's this like? That feels so good. Forgiveness, welcome, restoration, redemption, resurrection. We need that. The world needs that desperately. Because we're not in control. And here's the third one. I think the world needs a vision for what equitable communal wealth looks like. That's a thing that the early church did that I'm not sure that the current church has decided to touch.
Right.
But the early church sold things, owned everything in common, and gave to those as they required it, as they needed it. That's the big one in America. We don't have collective security, we have individual security. And our politicians fight like hell to get tiny pieces of collective security, only to get them snatched away.
Right.
Washington is the 49th in terms of progressive tax policy, only because of a law that we changed recently that's looking like it's going to go backwards. We're going to go back to 50th in terms of progressive tax policy in the country. The world doesn't know, well, America doesn't know how to do collective wealth and security. It does not know how to do it. And I think there's a lot of fear in trying it. What would it look like for the church to be a place that not only did the work of worth and dignity, and the work of forgiveness and redemption, but also the work of collective wealth and security? Now that's a Pentecostal church that I want to see. I don't know how we do it. I don't have a plan. I'm just saying that was a foundation for the early church. And ever since empire got a hold of the church, that's not been a central point anymore. We are called as people, as followers of Jesus, and as people who have the Spirit implanted in us, to build a new memory in ourselves, and then to share that memory and call others into that memory. Who we are, who God is, what it's going to look like to move together.
Amen.